Failure is part of being human. We don't like to talk about it. We may say it's okay to fail, but that word failure seems so permanent. It seems so lasting. But it's okay to be a failure if we look to the right people to be faithful. Let's check it out today.
Well, good morning. How are we doing today? Tired because it's muggy outside and we're like, what's happening? It's hot and it's not raining, so it's just terrible. But hey, we are so glad that you are here today. If you are visiting with us, we'd love to meet you at the tent right after church and just be able to chat and say hi and get to know you a little bit better. But hey, today we are going to continue on in this series we've been talking about in the book of Genesis, and we're going to see someone fail. Now, failing today in our world is often seen as something funny. If you Google fail videos in YouTube or on Google, this is what you get a lot of. I know, because I did research this week, okay, for hours upon hours of watching people fall. And it was hilarious, okay? It's fun to watch people fail in a lighthearted way. It's fun to even look at ourselves when we mess up or there's something small and funny and insignificant and laugh at ourselves. But we don't like to laugh at ourselves when we fail big. Or when this word comes and we move from just failing and it being funny and it being lighthearted and it being nothing to, I feel like a failure. Our world actually doesn't like that word, I would say failure at all. I remember when I was a kid, I used to think it's like, when there's so many leadership books on it now, is like failing forward and you only truly are a failure if you stop trying, right? That's what you've heard before. And that's probably, I don't know if that's actually biblical. I think that's just kind of a little bit of garbage, but it sounds good, right? Because there are times when we're just a failure. And when we don't measure up to what we should be doing, we don't measure up to what God has. And here's the super encouraging thing I want to start us off with today is that our failure is unavoidable. I know that just makes you feel really warm and fuzzy on a Sunday morning, right? That our failure is simply unavoidable. And so often our failure doesn't come when we are anxious, and this is the hard part, or it doesn't come when we're down and we think that like we're out looking for it because we're like, man, my life's been a mess. I'm just gonna really bottom out and I'm gonna fail hard. It actually sometimes happens when we're at our best. If you've been following with us these last couple weeks, we've been talking about a character named Noah in the Genesis story. And Noah was a man whose story starts in Genesis chapter 6. And in Genesis 6, God comes to him and he says that the world is so bad. And he uses this phrase that every inclination of the human mind is evil all the time. He says, the world is so bad, I'm going to start over. I'm going to send a giant flood. Every living creature on land and the air is going to die, but I'm going to save you. He said, build a big boat. It's going to take you a lot of years. Build a boat, fill your family with it, fill animals with it, and Noah does. And as the flood rises in Genesis chapter 7, he's safe as everything else around him, this catastrophic event, dies. But Noah stays faithful. He stays patient. He keeps trusting God. And last week we saw in Genesis chapter 8 that God finally, after being on a boat for a year, that's a long time, right? That with animals, that the waters go down. That all of a sudden dry land is coming about and Noah finally gets to step off a boat. It's probably like when you take a long flight, okay, like the longest I think I've flown is to Hawaii before. That was about 6-7 hours. And you like stand up and your legs I just feel so good. Imagine being on a boat for a year. Like you walk on dry land, there's just something about it. You're like, this is like amazing. But not long after Noah gets off that boat, at the peak of his life, as God has protected him, as God has then promised him the future is going to be bright. He gave him a whole rainbow in the sky and said, I'm never going to do this again. And the future is full of hope. Not long after that, Noah falls straight on his face. And you see, sometimes in our highest moments, sometimes when we think we're doing so good, sometimes when we're skipping through life is when we fall on our face spiritually and emotionally and relationally in our worlds. We've seen this, sadly, in far too many ways in our culture today. There have been so many pastors, and it seems like month after month, there's a new story that comes up about a pastor, and it's not one that just fell out of relevance, not one that you never hear about, but one that is pastoring his church, is in the height of his ministry, and an affair happens. or there's some sort of laundering or some sort of abuse. And the devil, when we're at our best, when we look like we have our stuff together, is when he loves to come at us. So let's dive into Genesis chapter 9. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and flip to Genesis chapter 9. We're going to be starting this looking at verse 20. And when we begin looking at this story of failure in Noah's life that we can learn from, it starts with the failure of a father. Check out Genesis chapter 9, starting in verse 20. It says this: Noah, as a man of the soil, began by planting a vineyard. He drank some of the wine, probably a lot of the wine, right? He became drunk and he uncovered himself inside his tent. All right, let's stop right there. And this is what's happening. Noah, he gets off the boat and he starts his new life on dry land, right? And this is a good world. God took all the way out the sin, except for there was still sin in the people coming back out of the boat, right? But God gives him a clean slate. So he's like, you know what? I'm going to start growing stuff. And then let's think about this a little bit, because we don't get a strict timeline here, like how many years this happened. But I would say some significant time has passed. I can speak from experience that things does not grow overnight, especially when you're starting from nothing. If you've been here at Cross Church for a while, or if you've even been in the neighborhood for a while, you know that just at the end of this year will mark about 2 years since we started our community garden project. And out there for 40 plus years, that was dirt. The ugliest dirt you can ever imagine, right? Full of weeds, drugs, drugs, just trash. Everything would blow off the freeway as everyone's going, 90 down 19th Avenue, because that's apparently the speed limit. And it would just blow into that. But we started that project and we've been planting stuff and we've had some seasoned under our belt. What I've learned though, is when you just put a plant in the ground and put water on it, it doesn't immediately grow and be nice and beautiful. Did you know that? I did not know that. I thought it was easy. But it actually takes some time. It takes time of, making sure you're caring for it the right way, but it also takes seasons of that soil to mature, that soil to get even more deep in nutrients, because you bring in foreign, but it's going with the native. And season after season, you're getting a bigger yield, a bigger harvest. So Noah's planting this vineyard, and there's time that's passing. He's living in kind of the blessing of what God has given him. And I almost think, on a side note here, I would give Noah a little bit of grace if he had to get off a boat and drink a lot, okay? But some years have passed, okay? So he doesn't get a pass anymore, right? He's had some time to decompress of what just happened on a boat for 370 days. But instead, all this time is passing, and all of a sudden, we see Noah, and he gets wasted, he gets drunk, and he exposes himself. Not a great start for him, right? Now, here's the other thing I want to point out, is in just a minute, we're going to see that he gets caught. But here's the thing, is we also don't know if this is the very first time that Noah's gone kind of deep down this path. We don't know if this is the first time he's had too much to drink and literally got wasted, got outside of himself. I was doing a little research on this, and when you look at kind of crime statistics, for example, is they say for every 1,000 sexual assaults, 25 people are put in jail. For every 1,000 robberies, 20 people are jailed. For every 1,000 assault and batteries, 33 people are put in jail. You see, here's the deal, is the majority of crimes are not seen or reported or convicted, and so often it's many, many times, and a person is a repeat offender before consequences come out. And you see, our sin can be the same way. It's so often we're continually sinning. There's a sin that's a repeat offender in our life, and it has to get so far down the road before we actually get exposed and it gets brought into the light. And with Noah, we see it even gets deeper, because we're going to see how this affects his family in a second. And we're going to see how he gets exposed by one of his children as who actually finds him. But here's a little gut check question I have for us today, is what sins are you modeling to your kids? We're going to see in a minute how this has reverberating consequences. But we've been talking about this over and over again in the book of Genesis, is that the sins that we commit, that those around us and those closest to around us are the ones that are most affected. If you have children, you know this to be true, because sometimes it's not even the things you think you're doing, but the things you're kind of organically doing, or that's not in the back of your mind, that are modeling to your children. This summer, we had what we called family experience nights. And in that time, we had worship, we had games, but then we sent the kids away. And as parents, we went through small groups and training on how to be better parents, okay? And one of the eye-opening things as we're going through the small group material, and I kind of reflected on, is like God hit me and kind of prodded me with it, is like sometimes I'll be on my phone with my kids, I'll be like scrolling social media or playing a game, and my kid will come up and want to see what monster I'm defeating, and I feel like a child. But sometimes when they because they're like little ninjas, they'll just pop up and be right in my face, like, what you doing? And I'm like, oh my goodness, right? And I'll pull my phone away and I'll be like, dude, give me some space. And inadvertently, I thought about that. I'm like, when I'm pulling my phone away from my kid, what they're learning is that's my private business. No one else can see it. And I'm inadvertently telling them something I don't want them to know later in life, that what's happening on my phone is private when it should be shared and can be seen by my wife and everything else. But sometimes the little things we're doing in our lives, even if they're not bad intentioned, are sending messages to our kids. Like saying I have something to hide when I don't have anything to hide. And here Noah, by doing something he thought he was doing in his private life, by maybe he was enjoying a glass of wine because he was on a boat and reflecting on it for a long time, it turned into a habit that became destructive to his life. And then it had reverberating consequences down his family line, which we not only see the failure of the father, but we also see the failure of the son. Let's keep reading in verse 22. It says, then Ham, the father of Canaan, he saw his father naked, and he told his two brothers outside. Then Shem and Japheth, they took a cloak and they placed it over both their shoulders. In walking backwards, they covered their father's nakedness. Their faces were turned away, and they did not see their father naked. Now, when you first read this, you may see it and you're like, okay, yeah, that's like weird. I'm sure Ham might have had some like emotional scarring from that. Like, like walking in, seeing your dad passed out, drunk and naked. Probably not a good memory, right? That you're a treasure for a while. But you're like, what's the big deal? Like, why is it such a sin or so bad that Ham then went and told his brothers? Well, you see, in that culture and in kind of the Old Testament, that Hebrew culture, there was a huge thing about honoring your father and mother. If you actually go to Exodus 20, verse 12, when Moses is giving the 10 commandments to Israel, one of the big 10 is honor your father and mother. And actually in Deuteronomy, they sparse that out a little bit more. Deuteronomy chapter 21, verse 18 through 21. I just want to read this real quick. And this kind of talks about why this was such a big deal to honor your parents and what that looked like at this time. It says, if a man has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father or mother and doesn't listen to them even after they discipline him, his father and mother are to take hold of him and to bring him to the elders of his cities to the gate of his hometown. They will say to the elders of the city, this son of ours is stubborn. He's rebellious. He doesn't obey us. He's a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the city will stone him to death. You must purge the evil from you, and all Israel will hear and be afraid. You see what Ham did here, and you may read that, you're like, wow, that's crazy. Or you may read that of like, wow, I have something to take back to my kids. Don't take that out of context wrong. But here, the act at this time of what Ham committed literally could have resulted in his death. That's the punishment for how he dishonored his father in this way. And here's the question, because you're like, okay, we're not going to go stone our kids, right, for seeing something like that or for witnessing our sin. But here's what we do need to ask from the life of Ham. And I think another gut check for us, a question that we need to reflect on, is how do you respond when other people sin? How do you respond when other people sin? It's funny to laugh at videos of someone falling on their face and hopefully they're okay after, right? You never see the after video of like how bad the bruise is or if they had to have facial reconstruction surgery. But if it's online, right, hopefully they turned out well. But we can laugh at that and it's funny and haha, but then what happens when someone truly does fall around us? What happens when there are people that are close to us that sin and are hurting and they fail? How do we respond to that? You see, there's an expression that misery loves company. And so often when we're struggling in our sin, when we're struggling in our misery, when someone else messes up, sometimes, if you're honest, your natural reaction isn't, oh man, I really need to pray for them. Oh man, I'm so sorry. You're thinking like, man, I'm glad it happened to them too, so I'm not the only one messed up, right? And Ham here, instead of saying like, hey, let's correct this mistake. Hey, let's get my brothers and we can fix this. Instead, he laughed about it. That's pretty much what he did. He dishonored his father and he kind of rubbed it in his face. And you see, we should never laugh, cheer, rejoice when someone else sins, but it should break our hearts and it should cause us to pray for them. And this is actually a sign of spiritual maturity. Because the more mature you are and the closer you are to Christ, the more it's going to break your heart, not just when your family sins, not when your friends sin, but when strangers sin around you as well. You're going to hurt for them. You're going to bleed from them. And it's not going to be something we rejoice in. So let me close out this first section. I want to emphasize this again. You will fail. And I'll even go a step further. You are a failure. Could be a motivational speaker, I promise, right? I think that's the difference between a motivational speaker and a pastor is we get to be a lot more negative before we get to the good stuff, okay? We tear it all down. But you will fail, and that's okay. But here's the thing, is even though we can't avoid this failure, even though there will be times when it comes to our door and we can't get away from it, here is the encouragement and here's the good news, is that God's faithfulness is unwavering. The drum kit agreed, I think, so. My son recently, he's about to turn 1 year old, my youngest son, Arlo, and later this month he's turning 1. And one of the fun adventures recently is he's beginning to walk, okay? And I started saying this, he's beginning to walk. By the end of this week, he was like full on running through the house and walking like a little drunk baby because, and putting shoes on him is a game changer. Now he really can't walk. But as he started this process, what was interesting to walk is he would take some steps and he'd fall over. But when he fell over, he wouldn't immediately stand back up in that spot and walk again. Instead, he would crawl to a table, he would crawl to another person, he would crawl to something that he could then use to pull himself back up. And he would look for a stable foundation of something he could grab onto, that he could get his bearings set, and then he could go try to walk again before he fell on his face or on his butt. He's really good at falling backwards before he did that. And I was thinking about this, and as I'm watching it, I'm thinking our sin lives are so the same way. But often we don't take the advice of a baby and we do it the wrong way. Is when we fall in our sin, usually our first instinct is, let me just stand back up and start running again. And then we fall again and let me just stand back up and start running again. And we don't realize the problem is we don't have a stable foundation to hang on to. So every time we try to run away from a problem, or every time we try to do more on our power and keep going, we just keep falling on our face and falling on our face, falling on our face. We move to another state, or we start a new job and we realize the problem still persists because the problem is our foundation is rotted. And here we're going to see that as we look to Christ and as we look to God in here, that God's faithfulness doesn't waver. God's foundation does not break. In the way that they get out of this, and the way that we see the encouragement in here, is that God is still strong. Let's pick it up in verse 26, and we're going to see the first thing about God's faithfulness and how it is unwavering is that God is faithful in his judgment. Check out verse 24. And it says, when Noah awoke from his drinking and he learned what his youngest son had done to him, he said, Canaan is cursed. He will be the lowest of slaves to his brother. Now, when you first read this, maybe a few thoughts go through your head. And this is how I'm kind of mining the text this week. And my first thought is okay, Noah sounds angry. He sounds like me when I do something wrong and then my kid does something wrong. And instead of saying sorry for what I did wrong, I just yell at my kid and say, it's all your fault. And that's kind of what Noah's doing here, is he's just reacting. And he seems like this mean old man taking it out on his child. And actually what we're going to find out is this is his grandchild, not actually his son, that Ham, who did this to him. But what we actually see is there's a different aspect to this. Noah, is actually, when it goes into this, God uses this moment to speak prophecy through him. A few notes here is this isn't just a curse, or this isn't just a wish from Noah for what he would want to happen, but this is a prophecy that God starts to speak through him. In Canaan, this name that is said, that let Canaan be Shem's slave, is that he is actually, and he's going to get to that as slaves to his brothers, get ahead. But Canaan is the son of Ham. He is one of Noah's grandsons. And what he's going to talk about here is that because of the sin of Ham, he's going to model this to Canaan, and Canaan is eventually going to follow down in his father's footsteps. This is God prophesizing and telling what is going to happen as a result of this. And this is actually something we've seen throughout the book of Genesis in Adam, in Cain, that what Adam did, he modeled that sin to his son, and that sin, and his son had the choice, can I still go this way or should I trust God and continue to run in his own selfish ways? But for us today, one of the questions we need to ask ourselves in here is, do you accept God's judgment in our world? Because you may be thinking this sounds harsh, right? Okay, Ham messed up, and all of a sudden it set Canaan on this bad path, and then Canaan, instead of turning away from that, he just kind of dove right into it. But does he really deserve that judgment? Does he deserve, as a nation, to be enslaved? Well, Leviticus 18 actually gives us some context to this. In Leviticus 18, it actually tells us what kind of nation that Canaan would become. Listen to this in 18, starting in verse 1. It says, the Lord spoke to Moses. He said, speak to the Israelites and tell them, I am the Lord your God. Do not follow the practices, listen to this, of the land of Egypt where you used to live, or follow the practices of the land of Canaan where I am bringing you. You must not follow their customs. Verse 4, you are to practice my ordinances and to keep my statutes by following them. I am the Lord your God. Keep my statutes and ordinance. A person will live if he does them. I am the Lord. If you keep reading in Leviticus chapter 18, it goes after case of sexual immorality and idolatry of other gods. And what the picture that is being painted here is that Canaan would become this nation that would literally represent the epitome of an immoral nation opposed to God. And it all kind of traces back to this prophecy that Noah spoke here, and spoke a little bit in his anger, but God used this moment of anger to show what would happen. Now, as you hear this, again, I don't know about you, but it sounds harsh, and it sounds kind of unmerciful, and begin to ask, like, okay, just because mankind is sinful, just because it maybe deserves judgment, it doesn't make it easier to kind of swallow and understand. But as we said before with Noah, that God always finds ways to show his grace and mercy even when we don't deserve it. What's kind of cool is we've talked about this a little bit, that this book, Genesis, and the first 5 books of the Bible were written by Moses. And it was written sometime in the wilderness when he freed people from Egypt. God used him, and they're kind of hanging around the wilderness, and Moses would write it there, and he would never go into this promised land of Canaan. But that's as he's writing these books here, they're probably remembering and they're reading these. And when they're on the doorstep of going into this new land, there's this guy named Joshua who's a leader of that. And Joshua, when they begin to go into the land of Canaan, this land they would destroy and that God just said is wicked and needs to be wiped out, they would actually send a spy into that town to find if there was a person of peace. Who they end up finding is this lady named Rahab. Rahab is referred to as a harlot or a prostitute. And actually, in order to kind of help God's people, she actually lies to her own people, so she commits another sin in order to protect them. But what's crazy through this whole story is that Joshua and his men eventually would go in, they would overtake Canaan. Canaan isn't around today because it's been wiped off the face of the earth, but Rahab was spared. Someone who was part of those people, who was a sinner, who had a profession that you wouldn't really want to associate with, but God saved her. And then if you fast forward to the New Testament, she is in the genealogy of Christ. You see, even in judgment, even in our sin, even when the world is going so far away from God and so far down the wrong path, God has mercy and grace on us. And we see that in here as this prophecy is going forward of what kind of would take place in the future. But here's the thing, not only is God faithful in his judgment, he's also faithful in his blessing. Let's keep reading in verse 26. It says, he also said, "Blessed be the Lord, the God of Shem. Let Canaan be Shem's slave. Let God extend Japheth. Let Japheth dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be Shem's slave." This little phrase that he uses in verse 26 of "he also said" is important because many commentaries in kind of the original language suggest this means like a transition phrase. That he goes from a prophecy here in verse 25 to now he's kind of praying for a blessing for his family. And it's a request to God. And he starts praying to God. And he says, God, this is what I will for my kids who aren't jerks, right? He said, Ham, cut him off. But the other kids I like. Noah starts praying this blessing over them. And he starts praying for them and talking about, God, would you use them? Would you bless them? And here's the question that I think we need to ask today is, do you ask God, or do you ask for God's blessing in our world? This past week, our team was talking, our leadership team here at Phoenix, we were talking about just prayer life. And we have some things that we're really excited about coming up in the life of our church, of what it looks like around prayer. But one of the things as we were reflecting, kind of going through this devotional, is we said, and we're kind of honest, is sometimes our prayers are too small. Sometimes we pray for things that are easily in our control. Like, God, please help my finances, even though I already did my budget. God, help me be nice to my coworker when it's really just drinking your coffee and taking a deep breath, right? God, help me do my homework, or help me finish this assignment when it really just takes a little more discipline. But then on the big things, on the things we're really scared to pray about, like God, heal this, or God, transform that person's heart, of God, literally change the view of how my family sees things when they're staunchly against you, break their heart and open it up. Sometimes we don't pray those prayers. And I think what that says about our faith is often we're too scared to pray that, because what if God doesn't answer it? What if God doesn't actually bring forth what we search about, what we ask him to do? And you see, the Bible is full of prayers that maybe God hears, but he doesn't answer exactly to what they want them. But we should have faith that what God, when he is sovereign and he is faithful, that we should look towards him. And we need to ask ourselves is, do we ask for God's blessing in our world? Do we ask for God to move and to change and to heal and do miraculous things in our world today? And guess what? This goes back to where we started. That when we truly fail big, and when we truly fall on our face, and we truly feel like a failure that there's no getting out of, that we can't pick ourselves up from, that we need a really big God in order to truly pick us up. Here's how I want to close out today. And if you don't kind of hear anything else, I want to summarize it this way. And we're going to see in the very last verses of Genesis chapter 9, some of this kind of lived out, is that the faithfulness of God lifts us above the harsh reality of our failure. The harsh reality that is going to happen. It's inevitable. We will fail one day, and it is going to happen, but God's faithfulness can lift us above it. Check out verse 28 of Genesis chapter 9. It says, now Noah, he lived 350 years after the flood. So Noah's life lasted 950 years, then he died. You're like, that didn't say anything, right? He just lived and then he died, okay? We just know how old he was. People are really old, right? Around that flood time and before. And it's like, okay, but that doesn't tell us about how he lived out the rest of his life, how he would be remembered. But when we read the rest of Scripture, we see it always talks about the faith of Noah. How Noah trusted God, that he was patient with God. And despite this hiccup that happens in chapter 9, despite his failure, that he recovered from it. And then God used him. And God eventually would bring all the world through him. All mankind would eventually bring the line of Jesus through Noah's family. You see, this is what it goes back to, is you may be recovering from a failure in your life right now. Or maybe you're in the middle of it. Maybe you see things starting to drop and you want to stop it, but you just don't know how to stop. And you're just waiting for that moment where everything is going to come crashing down. But when that happens, we don't just look to the model of Noah, of one who God had grace on, one that God loved, but we can look to the New Testament and we can see the greater Noah in Jesus Christ. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus is often shown and depicted as kind of through the lens of some Old Testament heroes. is the original audience would know Old Testament names that maybe you don't know, but they would be familiar with, like Moses and David and Noah and Abraham, who were champions of their faith and of their past. But as they kind of heard these names and as they saw Jesus, Matthew depicts him as the greater version of all of them. And Noah, as we've got to study his life for the last 4 weeks, did a lot of amazing things. He was more patient than probably all of us combined in the room. Definitely more patient than me, right? He was more trusting than so many of us. He built a boat when there was no water coming down and believed in God when everyone mocked him. But he was still a man. He was still broken, and he still failed. But in Jesus Christ, we have the greater Noah. That when we fail, when we fall, that we can trust in a God who came here, who lived a perfect life, who didn't make those mistakes, who saw those trials, but still defeated them on the cross and raised again. And when we read this story and we kind of close out this section of the life of Noah, my prayer is that in our past, current, or future failures, that we would be able to look to Jesus Christ, to trust him, to grab hold of him, to let him be our foundation that we can build on forevermore. Let's pray this morning.